By the late 19th century, the United States Navy was suffering from an identity crisis. For decades after the Civil War, America had allowed its fleet to rot, while European powers embraced steel, armor, and long-range naval doctrine. When Congress finally agreed that the country needed modern battleships, it did so reluctantly. Afraid of cost, wary of imperial ambition, and obsessed with defending the coastline rather than projecting power abroad. That hesitation shaped everything that followed. Instead of committing fully to ocean-going battleships, lawmakers demanded ships that were powerful but small, heavily armed but cheap, defensive rather than global. Naval architects were asked to perform a contradiction, build modern battleships without embracing what modern battleships actually required. The result was a deeply compromised class of ships, and one of them would become infamous. That ship was USS Massachusetts, BB-2. Authorized in 1890 and commissioned in 1896, Massachusetts belonged to the Indiana class, the U.S. Navy's first attempt at true steel battleships. On paper, she was impressive. Thick armor belts, heavy main guns, and enough firepower to threaten any foreign fleet approaching American shores. To politicians and the public, she symbolized progress. To sailors and engineers, she quickly revealed something else. Her problems began with freeboard, or rather, the lack of it. Designers lowered the hull to save weight and reduce silhouette, assuming the ship would operate mostly in calm coastal waters. In practice, even moderate seas washed water across the deck. From the moment Massachusetts entered service, she was a wet ship, constantly battling the ocean rather than commanding it. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it had direct operational consequences. Water flooding the deck interfered with gunnery drills, soaked equipment, and slowed ammunition handling. Casemate guns mounted close to the waterline were frequently unusable in anything but ideal conditions. A battleship that couldn't reliably fight its own guns at sea was fundamentally compromised. As the ship entered routine service, another flaw became obvious. She was overweight. Armor thicker than planned, heavier turrets, and structural reinforcements pushed Massachusetts well beyond her intended displacement. Each additional ton forced the hull deeper into the water, making the freeboard problem even worse. The ship's designers had traded seaworthiness for protection, and then added more protection anyway. This weight distribution also hurt stability. Heavy turrets and armor sat high on the hull, raising the center of gravity. While not dangerously unstable, Massachusetts rolled heavily and sluggishly, making accurate gunnery more difficult and exhausting the crew. In an era when gun crews manually trained and elevated weapons, this mattered immensely. By the time the Spanish-American War broke out in 1898, Massachusetts was already revealing the limits of her design. She was sent to the Caribbean to support operations against Spanish forces, including the blockade of Santiago de Cuba. This was, in theory, the role she had been designed for: coastal defense, presence, and firepower near shore. She performed adequately, but never comfortably. The tropical seas highlighted her wet deck and limited endurance. Coal consumption restricted how long she could remain on station without resupply, and her low bow struggled in open water. While she helped maintain the blockade, she was not decisive. Faster, more seaworthy ships increasingly carried the weight of operations, while Massachusetts endured in the background. After the war, peacetime should have been easier. Instead, it exposed her weaknesses even more clearly. In late 1898, Massachusetts struck Diamond Reef while departing New York Harbor, flooding forward compartments. The ship survived, but the incident reinforced a growing concern. She was unforgiving to operate, demanding constant caution just to avoid embarrassment. A few years later, she grounded again, this time in Pensacola Harbor. These were not catastrophic losses, but they mattered. Capital ships were meant to inspire confidence. Massachusetts inspired anxiety. Inside the ship, design compromises created additional dangers. The decision to pack heavy guns and thick armor into a compact hull resulted in cramped internal spaces. Ammunition handling systems were primitive by later standards, and safety margins were thin. The ship left little room for error. That margin disappeared in January 1903. During routine gunnery practice, an explosion tore through one of her 8-inch turrets, killing 9 sailors instantly. There was no enemy, no combat conditions, only early 20th century naval technology operating inside a flawed design. The tragedy permanently stained the ship's reputation. She was no longer just outdated or awkward, she was dangerous. By this point, the U.S. Navy had already learned the lesson Massachusetts was teaching the hard way. Newer battleships were larger, taller, and longer ranged. They featured higher freeboard, better stability, improved compartmentalization, and safer ammunition handling. They were designed for oceans, not harbors. Compared to them, Massachusetts felt like a relic from an abandoned philosophy. Her service record reflected that reality. She cycled through decommissionings and recommissionings as the Navy searched for a role she could still fill. By the time the United States entered the First World War in 1917, she was no longer considered fit for combat service. Instead, she was pressed into duty as a gunnery training ship, preparing naval reserve crews for ships that would actually fight overseas. It was a quiet admission of failure. She could instruct, but she could not lead. In 1919, the Navy made a symbolic decision that sealed her fate. The name Massachusetts, tied to one of the original states, was removed and reassigned to a newer battleship. The old ship was reduced to a bureaucratic label, Coast Battleship No. 2. Identity, like relevance, was gone. In 1920, she was struck from the Naval Vessel Register entirely. Her final role would be purely experimental. In January 1921, Massachusetts was deliberately sunk in shallow water off Pensacola, Florida, and used as a target for coastal artillery and railway guns. The ship that struggled to function at sea was finally doing what she had been designed to do: absorb punishment. And then the guns fell silent. No scrap company found her worth salvaging. The wreck was left where it lay, slowly claimed by corrosion and marine life. Compartments filled with fish, steel softened into reef. What had once been considered a failure faded into obscurity. Decades later, divers rediscovered her resting beneath the Gulf waters. The wreck was eventually protected, designated a Florida Underwater Archaeological Preserve, and added to the National Register of Historic Places. The so-called worst battleship became one of the most tangible physical links to the Navy's painful transition into modern naval warfare. She did not fail in battle, she failed as a concept, and yet her failure mattered. Without ships like Massachusetts, the U.S. Navy might never have learned what it truly needed: higher freeboard, greater endurance, safer systems, and fewer compromises. Progress came at a cost, paid in discomfort, embarrassment, and lives, but it reshaped the fleet that followed.